innovations to market.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start with this first picture. It's an iconic picture, one that should all bring back memories for you all, which was 50 years ago. This is a picture of Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon. His picture being taken by Neil Armstrong, as we were the first Americans to walk on the moon after a decade of commitment from a president who gave an audacious goal for this nation to bring the best that we had to bring to land on the moon and bring the astronauts safely back. How many of you were around and remember seeing Neil Armstrong take those initial steps on the moon? Well, I too was a young kid, remember seeing that. I remember how profoundly impacted I was, saying, wow, how did we do that? That's the kind of career that I want. There was also another event that caught my attention at my young age, and it was the movie 2001: Space Odyssey. And if you remember, there's a scene in that movie where there's a Pan Am space line taken off from the airlines of that day, shuttling passengers between the Earth and the moon. And I remember thinking as a young kid, wow, that's my future. That's the future I'm going to have a chance to live in. Well, that future didn't come to pass. The country moved on to other priorities, and frankly, the government has become much more risk-averse as we go forward. But I was not deterred from that and decided to go on to get an engineering degree. And in my senior year in college, I remember sitting down, a little disappointed that that future didn't come to pass, and I said, what does it take to invent it? So I remember sitting down, doing the calculus, and unfortunately, it came out that if I could raise a couple $100 million, I could start a company in space. Yeah, $100, $200 million to launch, $100, $200 million just to put up one satellite. Well, it was pretty clear that that was not going to happen. So I took on a very traditional path in the space industry until I had a call in 2011. Richard Branson asked me to join his company called Virgin Galactic. Richard Branson had a vision that says it's time to democratize space. It should not only be the province of great countries and federal agencies, but it should be the province of the private sector. And anybody who wants to go to space should have the opportunity to do so. In this picture is what we built and tested. It's a spaceship that can go to the edge of space and back, not to the moon, but at least gives anybody who wants to and is willing to pay the opportunity to go to space, to look out in outer space and look back at the Earth. This year, the vehicle was actually tested and successfully flown, having 3 private astronauts that got their astronaut wings pinned on them. The company went public a couple months ago. Its current valuation has a market cap of $1.8 billion. And starting next year, they hope to open up for passengers to start flying to and from space. That vision of Richard Branson was not his alone. There are other pioneers that are out there that are also excited about the possibilities of what we could be doing in space. And one of those is Elon Musk, who created his own company called SpaceX, who had the audacious goal of saying, why does the government have the only means of launching satellites into space? I want to do that, but I want to do it at a fraction of the cost that's currently being done. Well, people said he was crazy. The government pays for these rockets. How are you going to compete with a publicly subsidized rocket? Moreover, he said, I want to drop the cost, not 10 or 20%, but 50%, 75%. And I want to introduce new technologies that are going to reuse boosters to do it. Well, many in the industry said, that's crazy talk. It's not going to happen. Last year, he flew his largest rocket yet. It's the biggest one in the US industry. And on that day, 2 of the boosters that were used to carry that rocket into space actually turned around after letting go of the upper stages and returned back to the Kennedy Space Center. And if any of you remember that moment, I recommend that you should YouTube that. But there was nothing more beautiful than seeing 2 rocket vehicles autonomously run on their own in an absolutely perfectly synchronized fashion, landing back at the Kennedy Space Center where they took off. It was literally an iconic moment for the industry, where lots of people saying, heck, if he can do it, I can do it too. So as a result, we've now seen a large gold rush of companies that are out there that are trying to introduce their own forms of transportation to drive the cost down. Some crazy innovative ideas, from launching rockets off the wings of airplanes, to flying them off of high altitude balloons, to putting them in a centrifuge and whipping them out there, and to have them completely 3D manufactured from the bottom up. I don't expect all these are going to make it to market, but that's the beauty of capitalism, entrepreneurship, and innovation. But the other aspect of this is the cost of getting into space has now gone way down. And it now helps the other side of the equation, the satellites that we actually launch. About 20 years ago, some university researchers said, well, I too can't afford for these big satellites. Why can't we build a satellite the size of a shoebox? So they did. Now, at that time, these little shoebox satellites really couldn't do a whole lot, but they were pretty good for initial university research. But here we are 20 years later, and with the advances we see in micro-miniaturization and networking and the power of computing, these little Curiosity satellites, now called CubeSats, are literally changing the landscape of how we fly satellites into space. Now, instead of flying one big satellite on one big rocket, as shown in this picture here, now there's a myriad of different size, very small satellites that are being flown. The beauty of these small satellites is they're not the $100, $200 million type that I talked about. These now are not 10 million, but as little as 1 million, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. In fact, a student that was like me in their senior year could sit down and put together a $1 million business plan that can build one of these satellites, put it on one of these cheap launches, demonstrate it in orbit, go to Silicon Valley, get a series of funding to go into production on their products. And it's happening now. Today, there's a variety of companies that are moving away from these big, expensive, largely government-paid-for satellites to a new model where instead of having a big satellite, 3 or 4, you have dozens, hundreds, even thousands of these really small satellites and an incredible constellation around the globe, giving a global connectivity no matter where you go. In fact, if you look at what's being registered to launch over the next 5 to 10 years, there could be more satellites flown into space than in the previous 60 years of all the satellites flown from throughout the world. This is game-changing, and this is really exciting. And investors are taking note of this. In fact, what used to be about $500 million a year invested in new space ventures has grown to over $3 billion. In fact, we see the number of investors has grown tenfold. There are 400 new private space startups that have occurred that have gotten investments of over $19 billion. And Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs have projected that the size of the space economy is going to triple over the next 20 years to over $1 trillion. This is really exciting. And the government has noticed. The government, too, is going for its own transformational changes. NASA has recommitted to going back to the moon, this time not just for footprints, but this time to stay for long periods of time. And they know they can't do it alone. So they're undertaking public and private partnerships as they go forward. So you get companies like SpaceX, shown here with a prototype rocket that they hope to demonstrate later this year, that they hope someday will be able to get to the moon, and eventually their vision is actually it's going to be big enough to ultimately go to Mars. Jeff Bezos has just announced a national team led by his company, Blue Origins, teamed with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman to build the lunar lander that NASA would use to actually land on the moon. And so yes, Amazon will be delivering our cargo and our astronauts to and from the moon. That's the kind of shift we're seeing on the NASA side. And it's not lost on the national security side. Just yesterday, Congress passed legislation to create the newest military service in the Department of Defense. It's the first one in 70 years since the Air Force is created. It's called the U.S. Space Force. Now, why are we doing that? Well, for 60 years, we have had GPS and communications and weather and intelligence that has come from a constellation of satellites that have been able to operate without any interference. But in the last 10 years, the Russian and the Chinese have increasingly developed capability that would actually threaten those assets in space. And therefore, there's the call to be able to be much more responsive and much more innovative. So now the national security side of our government is also looking at public-private partnerships. They're looking at completely different models using these very launch vehicles and these very types of satellites to do things very differently. Finally, the question is, what does this mean for tomorrow's workforce? Certainly, it inspired me. In 1958, President Eisenhower passed the National Defense Education Act. It had a profound impact on this country in response to Sputnik and helped to finance the generation of those engineers and scientists that were driven and excited by the Apollo program. It's what I would call Space Race 1.0, driven by footprints and flags on the moon and the supremacy over the Soviet Union. Now today, 2/3 of the US population was not alive to actually see Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to step on the moon. And so now we're talking about Space Race 2.0. It's being driven by innovation, it's being driven by entrepreneurship, and it's being driven by the democratization of space. I think that it's a very exciting time for America's space program. I think space can be the engine that'll drive new innovations for our economy, and it would also be the engine that created a whole generation of scientists and engineers back in the 60s, will create a new generation of scientists and engineers driven by ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and the democratization of space. Thank you.